Good morning, everyone. I think you all know me, but I'm anyway going to introduce myself. I'm Ranji Khanna. I'm the current director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, and I am so excited to be here this morning with our founding directors, Karla Holloway and Cathy Davidson. When we're reflecting back on the humanities at Duke and the constellation of figures that made it, including FHI, we also have to remember, sadly, some who have passed on. I want us to just take a few moments of silence for our colleague down the corridor, Hans van Meegroot, who did so much, sometimes controversially, to change the field of art history and change it into the Department of Art History, and Visual Studies. I knew him personally as the other chair in the East Duke building for many years. I would talk to him frequently, in fact, perhaps also controversially, about having his space once he moved to Smith Warehouse. So if we could just take a few moments. Thank you, everyone. So on to the business of the day. I am truly, truly delighted to introduce this morning Karla Holloway and Cathy Davidson, who were the founding directors of FHI. As you all know, if I were to introduce either of them adequately, we would be here all week just listening to me, and I hope that our conversation today is anyway going to open up the extraordinary relationship that they have represented as they navigate between really amazing scholarly careers, an investment in a vision that is shaped by a politics and a form of knowing that pushes boundaries constantly, an administrative insight, a fearlessness and a risk-taking, and an extraordinary also agility among different fields of study, as they now actually have both turned to creative writing. Karla received her PhD in linguistics, a very interdisciplinary form of linguistics. So she moved from a number of different forms of linguistics, following partly in the footsteps of Zora Neale Hurston, one of the figures who she wrote about extensively in her early career, but also someone who stayed with her, I think, throughout. As a linguist and a novelist. She came to Duke in 1993. While she was here, she served as Dean of Social Sciences and Humanities, excuse me for that. She received a master's in law at the law school, and her field-defining books in linguistics, law, literature, cultural analysis of Black culture, including practices around death cultures, works on Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, Toni Morrison, to just name a few, alongside figures like Barbara Christian. She was instrumental in both paying homage to and developing reading practices around Black women writers and changing the course of feminist thinking and reading practices early on. In her early work, painting the picture of the bookish figure, and also alongside that, a very public one, activist, professor. Her books include New Dimensions of Spirituality, a biracial and bicultural reading of the novels of Toni Morrison from 1987, The Character of the Word, the text of Zora Neale Hurston, also from 1987. Not sure how that happened. We should all take some guidance from that. Moorings and Metaphors, Figures of Culture and Gender in Black Women's Literature, 1992, 1995, Codes of Conduct, Race, Ethics, and the Color of Our Character, 2002, Passed On, African American Morning Stories. 2006, Bookmarks, Reading in Black and White, a memoir. 2011, Private Bodies, Public Texts, Race, Gender, and a Cultural Bioethics. And 2014, Legal Fictions Constituting Race, Composing Literature. And I understand we have some copies of that outside if you would like to get a copy of that. Karla's most recent novel, Gone Missing in Harlem, has made an extraordinary impact, as well as A Death in Harlem. She is working with developing book clubs and has really sort of, I think this continues a kind of strong interest in the way in which we read, right, which has really been fundamental to her work from the beginning. The way in which we read, the way in which we tell our memoirs through the books that we read and love as well. Cathy Davidson, I remember, actually I should say that we have had book watchers for both Cathy and Karla at FHI at different moments. I remember when we had one for Cathy Davidson, our president at FHI at that point, Dick Brodhead, said that Cathy had invented the US 18th century. There just wasn't an 18th century before then. Her work has been in the history of technology, the history of the book in the US, the history and future of higher education, digital media and learning, digital humanities, critical university studies, the role of technology in culture, cognition and learning, industrial and post-industrial society, American cultural and literary studies more broadly. Her many books include The New College Classroom, A Practical Guide to Inspired, Effective and Inclusive Teaching, The New Education, How to Revolutionize the University to Prepare Students for a World in Flux. I'm just sort of skipping over some here for the sake of time. Revolution and the Word, The Rise of the Novel in America, and Closing, The Life and Death of an American Factory, with photographs by Bill Berger. Subjects and Citizens, Nation, Race and Gender, From Orinoco to Anita Hill, co-edited with Michael Moon. And just one more for the mix. The Book of Love, Writers and Their Love Letters. I want to just say also something about both of them, is that the ability to imagine different futures administratively has also led them both, I think, to an interest in speculative fiction and sci-fi. I understand that both have taught, even in the early years, courses on science fiction, and it has stayed with them. It has stayed with them throughout. So with that, I'm going to close off the introduction and come and join you over there. Okay, well, maybe we can start with a question about John Hope Franklin, who, of course, the name has stayed, and not with great ease, I understand, right at the beginning. I'd love to hear a little bit about your decision to work so hard in creating the Humanities Institute and also the John Hope Franklin Center as the John Hope Franklin Center and Humanities Institute. And you know, I mean, I think of this in, you know, Karla, obviously you have had a strong interest in law and literature. I know that your parents, as school teachers and instrumental figures in the Buffalo School Board, were very involved in the history of history of desegregation and activism around that. So John Hope Franklin must have been a very significant figure for you, and obviously has been for the university as a whole. So I would just love to hear about
I could respond to that.
your decision process, how you went about that, the challenges.
When you say that, I gained favor in my parents' eyes, and they said, "Oh, you're at John Hope Franklin's institution." You know, when I told them I was moving to Duke, and that's how they connected it, because there were, I think I wrote this somewhere, there are two thick books in my house, the Bible and From Slavery to Freedom. And, you know, I think Slavery from Freedom, the early editions were a bit longer. You know, so those were the books on my parents' bookshelves. So he has been in my life since bookshelves have been in my life. But now I don't know which came first, Cathy. Did our sort of internal politic about Duke has to institutionalize John Hope Franklin, which was a part of this, come before or after the idea for the Institute and the center?
I can't remember which came first. I do remember the controversy about the building. Should I tell that?
Yeah.
So Duke has a law, rule, endowment, indenture, something that says you can't have your name on a building unless you as a living person, unless you contribute so much money. It's many millions and lots of zeros. But Karla was dean and I was vice provost at the same time. And we had a president and a provost who adored John Hope Franklin. So if you go by the Franklin Center on whatever road it's on.
Is it Irwin Road?
What is it? Irwin Road. You will notice a very beautiful artist-crafted sign that says John Hope Franklin Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies that's about this far from the actual building. And that's because you can't have a building with a living person's name on it if they didn't contribute millions and millions of dollars. So technically, that sign is not on the building. And Nan was insistent that we keep the bushes trimmed always, so no one would miss that sign as people went by. So she was in cahoots with us when we did that.
Myrna Adams, whom
And
I
Myrna
understood
Adams
was honored last night, was was helpful in our insistence that that be there was this space, but the space on Irwin Road, we wanted the community to be able to see Duke's commitment. And then we didn't want the bushes too high. Cathy chose the nickel lettering for the sign. Yeah, you did. I remember that. We both chose the keep the wood floors, remember? Yeah. I mean, we were involved in things that we never should have been involved in.
And so was John Hope.
Yeah.
We went through the building with him in a hard hat, walking over this catwalk. There was nothing below. I thought,
was
oh
so
my
scared
God,
what we
we're going to kill John Hope Franklin. But he insisted. He was amazing.
Yeah.
Very proud. It was incredible.
And then remember choosing the office for him, which I don't think he ever really used, but I actually bought, because I don't know who called me on this, I wanted a wooden wastebasket. They cost $200. And it's John Hope's wastebasket, So there's a $200 wooden wastebasket in the Franklin, because he couldn't just have metal or plastic, recycled. No, it wouldn't work. But so down to that, and Cathy's insistence that on that opening, each office have an orchid. I still have one that is still growing that he gave me from his greenhouse. But his presence at Duke was important to the institution, especially to Nan Cohen. But Duke didn't quite know how to negotiate importance in the way that I think we developed a vision for it. They were, during the snowstorm that shut off all the power, Nan had brought him to her house to stay, so he would be so they were wonderful.
Right, and we all stayed in the Franklin Center.
Yeah.
And several people here probably were running around in their PJs during that storm in the Franklin Center. It still had heat.
I was home. I do have some boundaries, but
Me too.
fewer these days. But I think to answer your question, our interest was to help Duke institutionalize his importance in a way that would last beyond all of us.
Exactly.
And so I think, and I don't know when the Humanities Institute's Franklin Center, which I believe gave us a lot of trouble, which one does what, when, and where.
Right.
And we had this embarrassing, do you remember our organizational chart that we presented to the Trinity Board of Governors? I hope that is ditched. That we didn't know anything about org charts. You probably did. But we had lines going everywhere, coming up and reporting to. Do you remember? I mean, but the Trinity Board of Governors wanted to know what it would do. So every time we thought of a new thing, we drew a new.
This was a rogue operation.
It really was.
Supported by the president, who was a pink diaper baby. Her parents were civil rights activists herself, so she also, as we did, and especially your family also so powerfully, grew up with knowing who John Hope Franklin was. Although he and I spent most of our time fighting about fishing. Because at the time I was he's a famous fly fisherman and I was a bait fisherman, so we would fight about that all the time.
I did not fight with John Hope.
You're not a fisherman.
He fought with Bill Clinton because he was on the President's Commission for, which had its faults because the argument there was he was a President's Commission on Race, and the Indigenous Americans wanted to have a voice in that, and John Hope didn't quite understand a way to articulate an argument why it should be just about Black folks and white folks. Yeah. But then that was when Monica Lewinsky's affair came out, which diminished the, as far as he was concerned, the stature of his commission. He did call me from Air Force One once and said, guess where I am?
That's cool.
But then the association, the politics of that era did not help, I think, I think embarrassed him to an extent. So we wanted also to do something that would not be embarrassing, which was why we didn't tell him most of what was going on, I think.
Thanks for that. I mean, it's so interesting to me that he was such an important figure, but also that building had such an interesting constellation of figures and departments in it. So African-American history at the time was there. When it was set up, certainly the Humanities Institute, eventually French and Francophone studies, many of the international studies programs, and it always seemed to me. So I came to Duke in 2020, and so it was soon after
2020.
Everything.
No.
2000.
Okay, because I'm all right.
You mean 1920?
This century. It feels like 4 years.
I still feel like a newbie. What can I say? And so I came to Duke in 2000. So it was just after the building opened up. And in fact, I remember on my campus visit, Karla, you were a little scary on my campus visit, I must say. I was a little intimidated.
It's the dean's job.
It's the dean's job. It's the dean's job. I certainly knew what I needed to do to get tenure by the time I left it.
That's helpful, wasn't it?
It was very helpful. It was very helpful. All these moments are very, very helpful. And Cathy, you, I think, had also, Karla, you told me about FHI, and Cathy, you weren't around, and you wrote a note about what you were trying to do there, and
Cathy's notes,
and how and yes, some of the ideas about putting these departments together in a way that made the Humanities Institute both domestically responsible to questions around the history of race, but also international in its perspective. And it felt like everything in that building was gesturing towards that, to understand, as John Hope Franklin did, in fact, the question of African-American studies in the history of American studies more broadly, American studies in the world, and obviously the history of the transatlantic slave trade within that. And also, there was a way in which international studies was forced to be engaged with the humanities in ways that it's often not,
No,
right,
that's right.
in various institutions. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, some things that were presumably serendipitous, but I'm sure many things that were
Oh.
very engineered
Oh, yeah.
in the constellation.
More than engineered. Did we manage to get Women's Studies program and African American Studies program departments before or after the Franklin Center? Because that also happened, because it just happened the two people who were friends and in the positions of power at the same time were able to get department status. But I can't remember if that was before or after.
I think
It was
Mark
after?
Anthony Neal's responsible for the department status of AAAS. I think I was responsible for making sure that it had its own tenure lines, but I actually wanted it to keep the word program in it because that's what marked its interdisciplinarity. And, so there's always
But
this
it
struggle.
is a tenure granting
Oh,
program. Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely,
it is. And that came out of the battles that when I was first appointed, before I was appointed dean, I was head of AAAS. And the battles I had with departments and trying to get shared faculty lines was just nonsense. And some departments that turned down appointments of people who have gone on to extraordinary fame,
Right.
but had their own. I remember arguing with political science, frankly, about whether or not Brazil had a race problem that ought to be named. And I'm saying, you've got one of the so it was the frustration of having to, ask permission to hire someone that led me to that presentation before academic council where one famous professor said, well, there are a lot of insects in the world too, so should we have a department? I said, well, go ahead and have your insect department too. But, but one of whom was nice enough, who was on the academic council, wrote me a letter of all of his concerns prior to the meeting so that I could address them in the meeting. And I thought that was very savvy. And I would still call him a friend of mine because he knew exactly what he was for it, but politically and intellectually he wasn't. But he was supportive of if I could come up with a good enough argument, So I think once it got to your level, approving the faculty lines was what the provost would suggest should or should not happen to the entire faculty. But it was a decanal matter prior to that, and it was instrumental in what happened later with how we configured. I think it was serendipitous that both Cathy and I were in the positions we were in at the moment, and there were people who said, "How did we let this happen?" And we had our own set twos as but I think
Structurally, we should hate each other. I mean, the way universities are
Yeah.
in terms of infrastructure, provosts and deans are at odds with each other. They are, one guards one kind of territory and one guards the territory that's being guarded. So that we pulled off what we did and stayed friends is kind of a miracle.
Well, it was partly because of the faculty. I remember Charlie, is Charlie, didn't I? Charlie, you asked the question, which has stayed with me all these years about, so are we a post-departmental university now? I said, whoa, that's deep. What, maybe, should we be? Because my responsibility was to the faculty and departments.
Right.
Hiring in departments, making sure departments had the budgets and the lines they needed to. And at the same time, creating this space where faculty could escape to. So it was contradictory in some way. And I had to think through what a center and institute would mean in what was arguably a post-departmental culture world. I mean, that was just so brilliant and helpful. So the faculty made this happen.
Right,
Really.
there's no question.
We were the
No
cogs in the wheel.
It couldn't have happened if we didn't have a great faculty to be able to point to, stellar people, many of whom had not been treated so well, but, so, or been respected as they should have been. On the international question, Ken and I were thinking about this recently. I think one of the first exhibits we had at the Franklin Center was Oceans Connect, talk about
Yeah.
something that was way ahead of its time, and especially looking at race across all of these different Black diaspora, across the ocean, Indian Ocean. I mean, it was you were many people who were here were part of that. That was really quite a visionary event to have very early on. Also, when we opened the Franklin Center, it wasn't just hundreds, maybe even thousands of people from Durham and from the U.S., but we had a conference call. It happened to be a conference call because the technology went out, and Mark Olson brilliantly on the spot that we were part of the hospital center and they thought they were being hacked. So on the day of our opening, they shut off our technology, hoping that, and we were having a conference with students and faculty in Ghana,
Right.
where John Hope had just been, and there was no technology. So on the spot, Mark put up a PowerPoint and set up a conference call, and nobody knew that it wasn't some state-of-the-art technology that we were doing between the two continents. But it was John Hope who absolutely said, if my name's going to be on something, it needs to be international.
That was him.
And he insisted on the African presence at that event. Boona, you're here today. Thank you so much for being here. So meaningful.
So maybe we could actually probe this question a little bit more about departments and interdisciplinarity. Cathy, you were the first Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Affairs. Karla, you have just spoken about your exchange with Charlie, and the strength of having these programs that eventually could award tenure, etc., and broke a certain kind of model without breaking the departments as such, or those programs. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about what your visions were of interdisciplinarity at that point? Of course, every university talks about interdisciplinarity, and Duke is, however, quite distinctive in the way that it's gone about it from an early moment. So I would just love to hear about.
I remember wanting to use that as our brand, in a sense. And John Burness, who was Vice President for Governmental or Communications, said every university says what we do is interdisciplinarity. What's different about Duke? But actually, part of my impetus was quite domestic. I was tired of seeing faculty who could not apply for these wonderful fellowships that would take you away from your home space, where you had responsibilities, whether they were, caring for elders or children or health reasons. Most of the fellowships in the United States that humanities scholars could apply for, other than the Humanities Center here, took you away. And that just did not make sense for wanting to make available for our own stellar faculty a space to do very focused work alongside others. Why can't we do it at home? So I remember that was part of my instinct to, and yes, this was, there are very few things that can be personal as dean. You quickly learn it's not about you, it's about the faculty, which is why after 5 years it needed to be about me, and I said, bye. You end up making room and ways and means for faculty, and at some point you say, gee, I want one of those things. But in making those, you got a good deal of satisfaction from keeping faculty here at Duke who might have gotten offers elsewhere or had to go elsewhere, Italy, to do scholarly work. So part of it for me was to create a domestic space, and I'm using that word intentionally, so that the appeal of scholarship, not necessarily in my head at that time interdisciplinary. Cathy can speak to how you got the first title of interdisciplinary provost. but for me was to create a space where scholars could come into a connection with others that we were interested in working with that didn't take us away from locations that we had other responsibilities to.
Yeah, my history is a little convoluted and political, but first of all, Duke used to be a sleepy Southern aristocratic sons and daughters of the Confederacy. That sounds mean, but I don't mean, well, yeah, I mean. Until the 70s, when somebody from the engineering school started working with somebody from the medical school, and the field of biomedical engineering was invented here. I mean, those were things that were not considered in the same universe before that. And that really changed Duke entirely, its place in the world, and its reputational status, its ability to recruit students, and its growth hugely. How I became the first Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Studies is a little scurrilous. The English department had fallen on complicated times, and Jim Sedow, the late lovely Jim Sedow, a biologist, was invited in to be the interim acting caretaker chair to try to set things right. During that year, one of our most famous,
that committee.
Pardon me?
That committee of 5 who ran the English department. I was on that committee.
Ooh, yeah. I didn't remember that.
Yeah.
Lucky you. Lucky you. Around the same time, one of our most prominent mathematicians and one of our most prominent physicists were about to be recruited elsewhere. Both did string theory. And I started as an undergraduate in math and physics, and Nan said, well, since Jim's running English, why don't you see what you can do to start a string theory group here and see if we can keep these people here. So I ran a little program basically in string theory between math and physics. And at the end of that, she said, what if we had somebody permanently in that role who could actually see possibilities that worked across and between programs, departments, disciplines, and schools? And so I became the first, anywhere, not only at Duke, but anywhere in the country, the first Vice Provost of Interdisciplinary Studies. And why you need not just one friend in high places, but more than one friend in high places is because my job made me the enemy of deans, because basically we had to tax, a word we were not allowed to use, every dean a very certain amount of money to go into a kitty for interdisciplinary projects. Well, you're asking people who have to spend their money wisely, and there's never enough, to give up money in order to do something collectively. And we also had to negotiate grants, which especially in the sciences meant huge amounts of money that had to be negotiated across programs. And we weren't completely a tubs on your own bottom school, which is a management style that means every dean basically has to come out zero, has to do its own accounting, both of income and outputs. But we were close to that management system. And within that system, we had to come up with a share system across schools. But that is not easy to do. And it meant you had to wear boxing gloves a lot, but velvet ones.
But notice how the respect for interdisciplinarity grew out of medicine and sciences. And so to pull that over, this is one reason I was irritated with humanities labs, because I said, yeah, we're using lab language in order to make it sound, scientific and fancy and relevant. But I lost that. I'm better with it now.
I love the labs.
I know she was, but you worked at Fermi. Cathy used to do projects for humanities projects for scientists at Fermi Lab in Chicago, which I only knew about because Ayana, my daughter, ended up, at Fermi Lab for a while before she went to Bell Labs. And it was the weird connection. So for physics, when physics has more credibility than an English department or Romance studies or African and African-American studies, and then we start using those models in order to suggest something for the humanities. That was always a balancing act for me that I low-key resented, but Cathy understood. Well, all right. It was not too much about me low-key, all right. Which is why I'm on Twitter hiatus for a while. But Cathy understood the second floor politics. Third floor? Where is? Yeah,
Second?
the second floor. We used to call Allen Building, but yeah, that's the second floor. That's the third floor was English. So first floor was Dean's level, and so you bring that up to the second floor. So
You getting off here on the elevator?
yeah. But she had red filing cabinets in her office, so she was already rogue.
There's still one over there.
Yeah, it probably came from your office. But what I do want to say institutionally is the way you end up having to work and what you have to swallow in order to get the humanities on an equal footing. We're not only budgetary, because sciences could raise money. I mean, that's how science departments are modeled, by the grants that they bring in. Humanities departments aren't modeled that way. There are a few more now, thank you, Elizabeth Alexander and those who are running Ford and Mellon and Woodrow Wilson. So there are more now, but still those often involve you working outside your institution. So getting proper notice and keeping the departments staffed and students central. I remember I always wanted, one of the reasons that departments were over there is because I wanted it to have, I had some word, and wanted the students to be in and out of the building. I didn't want it to be just a quiet space where, scholars worked and there wasn't any student traffic. Maybe I used that word, I don't know. But I wanted students to feel that they had a space there, so classrooms where students would show up. But knowing that scientists worked in labs and had their own labs and labs named after themselves, was a hard model to integrate into the humanities. And I thank Cathy for doing whatever battle she did, because I don't know what all had to happen, but I knew that I had chair meetings every month, I think.
Right.
And at those meetings, it's, how many faculty am I going to be able to hire, and what's our budget? And I never wanted us to become the counting students departments, which is how many majors do you have? Because Duke, so I don't know, maybe it slid that way, but Duke could so easily slide into your legitimacy depends on how many students you have enrolled in classes, and that would immediately have put us at a disadvantage. So balancing that was as not the way to evaluate our strengths. I ended up doing it in terms of, lovely Duke Press as the motto. Thank you, Ken. Look at what university presses publish. And when I was chair of the university appointments, promotion, and tenure, and I pointed out the way we tenure people is to say, where have they published? And if you look at where the publishing happens at Duke, happens in the humanities and social sciences. So using their own standards to say, this is why we should be able to hire our own faculty, because all of these university presses have lines devoted to, is that what you call them, press book series, devoted to Black studies now. And if they're saying it's legit, what's the matter with you people? So that was a really useful argument, and I thank Ken for his leadership then at Duke
So
Press.
sorry he can't be here today.
Ken
He's at
is,
College Art today in Chicago. He's on the board
See?
of the College Art
but
Association.
that's how you do it. You get on boards, you make your impact differently, and then the institution has to pay attention to what you're doing.
And needless
Which
to
is what
say, he's
happened to
very
you.
proud of one of his star authors. So that's good. You talked about the crazy dotted lines that we had to have on that chart.
If anybody ever finds that in some archive, you've seen it? Oh my
Do you
God.
have it?
You could hold that over me. Wait until I'm gone, please.
Wow.
If that were background today, we wouldn't have to say a word. All you'd have to do is look at that. And today, it's embarrassing, but then it was like, let's draw another line. Yeah.
Had to. And at the same time, though, that you were had to make the argument that how many majors should not be the criteria.
Mm-hmm.
On my end, I had to make the argument that, in fact, the humanities touch more students than the sciences do by far in terms of general education and other courses. And then we were also building, and I was very happy to be on that committee, one of the leaders of building the National Museum of Art and the new wing of the library. And So that was all part of, if you're investing here, then you've got to invest in the humanities. That's, if you're going to have programs in this art museum about this art, we're talking about the humanities. If we're going to have people using the books in that library, a lot of those people using those library books are going to be in the humanities. So my job was to make sure that what the Humanities Institute and Humanities Center did touched all of those provost areas that weren't about departments, but that are key to Duke's identity. Absolutely key and foundational to Duke's identity. And the humanities are. But that's, again, why you need more than one person in a high place, because you had to make one kind of argument at the same time that I had to make another kind of, and both of those were necessary for any of this to have happened.
Yeah. And the respect that I had for the work that department chairs have to do, understanding that, now I know why. I mean, when you become Dean, Gregson can tell you that Monday morning, right? Because for like on Saturday and Sunday, faculty sit back and think. And then Monday morning, your Monday mornings are horrible. And it took me so long to figure out what is it with Monday, but it's that Saturday and Sunday when people get, leave Friday mad and say, think about it Saturday. So Monday morning, you got that call. So I knew Mondays were especially tough, but they were tough because the reasons were absolutely legitimate, and then we were going through budget cut times and no faculty, no faculty raises. And, how do you continue to do excellent work if you're not going to support it in the way that institutions know support happens? I remember making the argument for every new budget at Duke should have 10% for the arts. I don't think that worked.
You did.
But I think at least the thinking about the arts, I remember being at meetings and raising hands and the arts, because meetings would go on and on at these executive levels, and people would forget that, the arts were not a part of our everyday conversation. And now there's a bay down there that, which I had fun with Bob. Who's the building person who? Bob Barkow.
Yes.
Planning that space for the visual arts at Duke, and so that they could have a space where they could really work rather than the East Duke where the rooms weren't set up for the arts. So that's one of the things that I was happy I don't know how this space came into Franklin. I think that was you, but the original Franklin. That's right. For the arts. And Cathy, I remember going, oh no, keep the posts and we'll build around them. And
we had the first artist in residence at the Franklin Center.
Yeah.
I just remembered her name earlier today, but I've just met too many people. Yes, Kelly Heaton, who was doing a project. She was a digital humanities artist, doing a project where she purchased on eBay hundreds of Tickle Me Elmo dolls.
Yeah, Elmos.
And she eviscerated them, hired a local taxidermist to put the Elmo heads on little, the way you put a deer head up. He said, these Elmos are just as expressive as the dead deer. And then she did a performance made of the skins of the Elmos, nothing else underneath, and she did this performance. But she was in this building when it still had these...
Killing Elmos,
when it still had these reams of cigarette papers. This building was originally for making cigarette papers. And one night around midnight, I got a call from the night watchman saying, there's this weird lady in this building. Surrounded by, we thought it was blood, but it seems to be fur colored and maybe in blood. It's all red. And she says she reports to you. I was like, it's Kelly. She's an artist. It's fine. But that was her office, was amidst all these rolling things.
She was working before the building was even finished for the arts. I remember that because it took me a bit to get that installation.
Well, one of the things that I think is very apparent from the conversation that we're having, and also perhaps in the story, another story beyond the 70s story of an investment in the humanities through the 80s, the hiring of lots of strong figures who were both established and also had a vision for how they might hire others into these. into the roles that eventually many people took on to shape different fields, is that there's a story of frustration as well,
really
right?
was.
There's a story of things falling apart, right? You very kindly put it as, there was the English department needed some help, and so I'm very interested to hear a little bit more about this. I mean, not necessarily
I don't
the
remember
English
a
department.
thing.
Everyone can read the lingua franca pieces,
Anything
etc.,
but
New York
that.
Times, etc. Not necessarily that, but the way in which, these things are experienced personally as frustration, hurt, the sense that a field is going nowhere or is so divided that it can't actually be held in a department context. And yet, it's also indicative of changes in fields, dramatic challenges, people who step out, who haven't necessarily been treated so well, as you also put it, and develop something new. So, but it takes something to do that, right? And not be depressed or destroyed by it. And
So, to drop a
did it.
name,
Yes.
I got a call about maybe 2 months ago. No, it was probably this summer, from Skip Gates. Yeah, I wrote an article on Equiano, and he was working on Equiano, and he came across my article and said, "Hey, now we'll just say he left in, I think, 1990. Is that right?"
Well, I'm here because he left.
Yes, exactly. I made a promise
He
that
left
we would.
courses, and I was teaching at NC State, and Alan Building gave me a key to the back door and a night course, and had me come in and teach the courses that skipped away from that Skip left. And so I always say I came in to do the back door at night and just stayed here. But interestingly, in terms of respect, I had an HBCU background. There were other scholars at Duke, Ray Gavins, who graduated from HBCUs. But that was an immediate non-starter for Duke. It was not until when Stanley made me an offer, it was because the University of Pennsylvania made me an offer and sent it by fax to the English department, which meant everybody at the English department knew that Penn made me an offer. And suddenly, in some people's eyes, I will say that people like Tom, you were supportive before, while I was still a visiting professor at Duke, and Ron Butters, pushing me, but Duke's own hierarchies in terms of who's going to offer value to the faculty.
No question.
Now when we see the president of the American Historical Association is a Hampton University graduate, so we have to understand how HBCUs have been in the pipeline. But I remember an early meeting at Duke with the Mellon Foundation, who said, you keep telling us to have students apply to your graduate programs and you don't accept them. And then I had to kind of step in and see what was happening. For one thing, HBU students, we write a different kind of essay when we apply to graduate school. It's about our work in the community, our responsibility to the community. And Duke wasn't reading, Duke departments weren't reading that in the way that students intended. So there did have to be a sort of reorganizing. This does, I think, apply to your question of how value was established at Duke, because I certainly didn't come in as a valued person at Duke. I came in as a replacement for the man everybody wanted at
And
Duke.
was chased out. Skip.
And was chased
So when he called this summer, a little bit of water has flowed under that bridge.
Yeah.
Right?
But he remembers, I bet.
All we talked about was how pissed off he was and how humiliated he was. That people wrote letters people in the English department wrote letters to the student newspaper talking about how Skip didn't deserve to be a faculty member.
It was, and knowing for some reason his salary and the house he lived in.
He didn't deserve it.
Thank goodness it wasn't a social
that
media
humiliation
age.
that hurt is still very much there after all the fame, everything he's done in the meantime. And so institutions
It's like people
do fall
remembering their
apart,
first rejections.
and they also continue their memories too. So you're always fighting not just the present, but these shadows and these, to quote the scholar who
But then-
talks about the hauntings and what's passed on still remains.
Then you have to figure out what is the language that will be institutionally credible and get you what you want. You know?
Absolutely.
So it is a goal oriented. So get a department. The English department is a fabulous department, even when it was administratively in tatters. It had some of the most fabulous faculty in the institution. So how is that overlooked? How are the, this is sort of like what I learned in law school. People are overlooked for the text. And it's the danger that institutions make in overlooking, well, who is doing this labor, folks, and how can we reward them better? The salaries in Romance studies were my focus. This is something that your office didn't have to worry about, but then I'm going to come to Romance Studies, and we're going to give your faculty a chance not to teach, but to come over to this fabulous institute and do whatever they want. But what about our students when you have just passed Curriculum 2000, it was given some funny name, that required languages. I know you're going through a different curricular review now. So glad not to be here. But if languages are important, why aren't you going to, pay faculty who teach languages what they deserve in ways that are equitable to other faculty across? So those concerns I had were also concerns that gave me angst in terms of the job I always understood the dean's job as a job of service to the faculty. What can I do to make your life better? What can I do to get you, I hope I said, what can I do to get you to be successful at Duke? So when people came in to interview, I'm looking at somebody. You guys have taught me more lessons than I might have scared you. I'm looking at Mark Anthony Neal, who also had apparently a traumatic visit. I remember Carrie Haney always tells me the first thing I told him is we don't reduce courses at Duke. He said before he sat down in my office, because I knew it was political science, he was going to ask for a course release. We don't do that. So learning to give you what you needed to get tenure. I think I used to tell people, if you're not bringing a person, bring a cat, and something to keep you company, because these are horrible years, and they will overwork you. And then telling department chairs, leave them alone. Don't put a new faculty member on every committee, even though the Franklin committee would, so it's like my life was a living contradiction for a while, and Cathy helped even it out. Because fighting with her was fun, because then we would go out and eat her munchy food later, because she never ate anything but carrots. And, you brought little carrots and celery sticks and grapes. I'm looking for some carbs.
Telling stories.
This is why you look so wonderful and healthy today. We are both, I think we are both within a year.
I think we're about the same age, yeah.
So,
47, yeah.
The idea of having a colleague that both understood the department, but whom we had a history at Michigan State before we ever got to Duke, made a difference. I always thought hiring faculty was hiring company, friends. Well, they wouldn't be your friend while you were dean, no matter. It was very lonely being a dean until I could do stuff, but it was never stuff I could talk about or tell people I was doing.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask just one more question, and then we're going to open it up. And that is that a couple of times the Mellon Foundation has come up, and Oceans Connect, I believe, was funded by Ford, I think. And then,
Ford,
but
yes.
then there were a series of Mellon
Shades of
grants.
Black, was that Mellon?
No,
No?
maybe not. Right. But we've had a lot of Mellon grants that have supported FHI and humanities projects in general. And it does seem as if now there is more of an insistence, which seems like the right insistence to me, that an institution like Duke needs to support certain things in the humanities itself, right? Such that such that there can be a broader distribution of those funds.
Yeah. It has to be an institutional obligation.
Right.
Our first grant came from Nan's private funds, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
as wonderful as that was, the reason this exists is because Nan Cohan took money out of her presidential funds to make it exist.
Yes.
Should never be the way something has to happen at an institution.
She too apologizes for not being here. I
Nan
told her I
can be-
was coming.
I
She's out
saw
at
her.
Stanford now. She's doing well.
That's good.
But she
I saw her at
specifically said she wanted to.
Christina's, inauguration at SUNY, so she was wonderful there. So, but Nan had to, I remember it was her almost the last semester of the last year, which she established the Women's Initiative and the Baldwin Scholars. And she didn't have the institutional backing to do that work for women at Duke until she was about to leave.
Right.
So rather than doing it at the beginning of her term, which would have given it a different kind of longevity and presence, she understood the politics of being the first woman president at Duke. And the first thing I'm going to do is for women. I remember when I was head of AAAS, and I was told by some of my own colleagues, you're just hiring women. Well, Paula Giddings and Juanita Lubiano were pretty good hires, but, so, doing things around women's issues and around race are still, I suspect, a territory for tension at
Right.
Duke.
Yeah, sure. Both. I've been very sad. I was a senior advisor at Mellon for a year right before the pandemic. And so I'm saying this partly as an insider, but very sad that both Mellon and, to my mind, even more tragically, the Fords have pulled back significantly from higher ed, not just from elite higher ed, but in general, and focusing on other things. I mean, I think the Ford program is one of the great success stories in American education, and that was abandoned is a real shock.
I had suspected, and you maybe can't say that this was part in anticipation of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. Because,
Fords?
Yeah. I know the Ford scholars are, that's an extraordinary community.
Extraordinary.
Another one of my early rejections, I still have the letter I got when I was at Talladega, said, sorry, you can't be a Ford scholar.
Wow. I thought you were a
Well, no,
Ford.
I tweeted it and said, see, y'all were wrong. Or I could say they were right. But I think they pulled back anticipating that the court
maybe.
judgment would make this kind of program, which focused on scholars of color, vulnerable. So
Might have been. Yeah.
and they were smart to do that. The institution, I remember saying a while ago that Duke needs to be very cautious around how we are naming and characterizing things, because if we don't, we're going to spend our time in court rather than
Well, that's-
supporting scholars.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a wise point. I hadn't thought about that.
But to your point, I think both of us would agree that this has to be an institutional, hard money, is that how you say it, Beth? Priority rather than depending on the willingness of a president or a foundation
Right.
for its livelihood. And I don't know how the Franklin Institute is funded now, but if it hasn't shown its extraordinary value in recruiting people, I think you're here because of Cathy's letter. But as long as we don't have to talk about the party where Jesse and Bill Cosby were in, we So when we had the opening of the Franklin Center,
Mark is laughing a lot. You know about that. We had to,
Bill Cosby was here to do I don't know if he was doing, but he was here. I remember him coming over to the
they
Franklin
were
Center.
fraternity brothers.
Yeah,
I mean, they're in the same fraternity. He and John Hope.
Yeah, but that's when we had to keep them in separate rooms.
We
remember?
sure did.
Okay. So
John
they
Hope-
would, when John Hope, well, not John Hope was fine with it, but Bill Cosby would not be in the same room as Jesse Jackson. There was a spousal issue happening.
There were a lot of issues.
And no, here we are dressed to the nines. I mean, I went out and got what do you call those things? St. John, which was, what Black women wore to be fancy back in the day. And we had this wonderful banquet. And Jesse Jackson showed up unexpectedly. He had been at A&T doing something. And I remember because I took him in my Volvo wagon over to the Franklin Center, and I didn't realize he was such a big man that he broke the seat to go back. And I said, well, we should sell this car, saying Jesse Jackson broke the car. But then I got a warning that he could not be in there at the same time that Bill Cosby was in the Franklin Center. They had to be separated. But the night ended well because they ended up taking pictures together.
I've got
so
a picture.
I don't know. Did you manage that?
I didn't manage it, but I have a picture in my office at the Graduate Center.
We had the picture of us with Bruce Cunningham, but I don't know how we got over
I don't remember
I will not
either.
be in the same room with this man.
If we're telling tales,
okay.
the University Scholars Program, which is a program that was funded by, she was very involved with Melinda French Gates, was also in the Franklin Center. And there was a lovely young woman of color, 19, who thought Bill Cosby was great. And there was a little too much flirting going on. This was before the scandals. And I said to Dr. Franklin, I said to Dr. Franklin, what do you think about that? He said, don't you think about it a second more. And he walked out,
took care of
hooked Bill Cosby by the arm. They walked out, and the demeanor changed. I have no idea what went on, but clearly the senior, what is the word in fraternity language for the senior fraternity member versus the
neophyte versus?
They used some term, but Dr. Franklin said he took care of it.
Okay.
He took care of it.
This was a man of such dignity, grace, and integrity.
Oh my God.
That you never wanted
Astonishing.
to take a wrong step in front of John Hope.
No, it was horrifying.
And he was generous. He told, and one of the reasons for his personality, he told me when he met Du Bois in a lobby of a hotel, and he went over to speak to him, and Du Bois kept eating his breakfast. And he was saying, Dr. Du Bois, I am such a fan, and he kept eating, did not acknowledge him. I think it was a train station. And he swore to himself that he would never be that kind of person. And so one of the reasons for his grace and his openness, you could not go anywhere with John Hope without, a slew of people coming up and following you. It was so fun to be connected to celebrity like that. But Duke owed him an institutional space that we were luckily in positions to fabricate, literally. But it should not have been as hard as it was.
Right.
But that's the story of a lot of stuff that happens.
Near the end of his life, very near, a friend of ours from Haystack, Allison Clark, was visiting. And she told me that her grandmother had been at, you're going to have to help me out here, Spelman, I would assume, at the same time that John Hope
was at Morehouse?
Was at Morehouse, and that they were friends.
Oh,
so I called John Hope up, and he said, would Clark like to go to dinner? So with Jim Coleman from the law school, and Ken and I, and John Hope and Allison went to dinner at Foursquare, is that right? Mm-hmm. And the entire staff lined, when they heard he was coming, lined the hallway and the walkway and clapped as he walked in the building. And he didn't order a thing. None of us ordered a thing. They brought out the meal the whole night. And then when he left, they did the same thing. Everybody came out. And that was a Wednesday, and he put himself into the hospital on Friday and never came out again. But not for a second would you have known the person you were having dinner with on a Wednesday would be admitting himself to the hospital on Friday. It was with such dignity and so much love and graciousness. Being able to know John Hope Franklin was certainly one of the greatest honors of my life. I mean,
that's why we know Buna today.
Yes.
And that's why we met Karen and Witt, as they call him. This was a good space to be named after.
It's a great honor and to be able to be a Humanities Institute named after John Hope Franklin. What could be better?
Thank you for that.
Better.
Can I open the floor? Sorry, who's at? I can't see who's at the back. Maybe if you could stand. Priscilla, yes, go ahead. Yes.
So let me first say that the two of you were two of the best possible colleagues anyone could ever want, and I miss you both incredibly.
Back at you. Back at you.
John Hope Franklin, I would also say about the two of you.
Oh.
Let me start there. And one of the things you both did so brilliantly and taught me so much was how to make lemonade, right? How to take a problem and I don't mean it literally, Cathy.
I was so confused.
You got your
I didn't
baseball
know how to
bat
make lemonade.
and your yellow dress.
I'm a famously bad cook.
No, take a problem and turn it into an advantage. So I would love to have you each maybe think about something that was a difficulty that came your way that you turned into something great.
Well, this institute
Yes.
would be the best. You know, it was impossible. You couldn't have a name on a building unless someone gave you $100 million or whatever the number was at the time. And so we built a sign on the front of the building. And technically, the John Hope Franklin Center is the collection of everything that's in the Franklin Center rather than the building itself.
That's a chart.
So,
Yeah,
thank you, Beth.
I think we had to keep an eye on, so remember a colleague who was then at Chapel Hill, he's now at Duke, William Darity, who told me, so what's your objective? You know, what do you want to happen? So an economist had to tell me this. Oh, well, I want the institute. So what do you have to do to get there? So rather than seeing the steps as, you know, this is bothering me or this should not happen, you have to keep your eyes on the prize. So if you see a way to getting what you want, you do compromise.
Right.
You know, you do things that, you know, you suggest. One of the biggest things I found out at Duke is administrators aren't terrifically good or were not interested in solving the problem. You know, you bring a problem, and so what you should have is both the problem and this is how you can fix it. So if you bring us and you do 1, 2, and 3, and we can get there together.
Right.
But it took me a while to realize that administrative strength was not in problem solving. It was just in finding the money or whatever, finding the space for it. But if you bring them the ways to get there, so
Huge
that's
help.
what a
Huge
lot
help.
of Cathy and I did. So how are we going to get this institute into the center and reward humanities a space without, because then it was the John Hope Franklin Center. You know, it didn't say humanities right out. We had to work that into that chart that you promised to. 25 years after I'm gone, we can really, you know.
When I worked at Fermilab, one reason I was brought into Fermilab is the Russian and American physicists, Fermi International Accelerator Lab. The Russian and American physicists weren't speaking to each other, and they thought if a humanist came in and put on a program for scientists, that maybe they would like each other, because humanists are humanitarian, you know, all that. And there were no walls at the Fermilab. Wilson, who was a physicist who also designed Fermilab, put no walls in. So people had walls of books. And I and some other humanists who were working on this project wanted to make a space where we could have reading groups and something that was set off from the physicists in a way that it could be more intimate and talking about. And the architect brought in plans for us, and we ripped the plans apart. And the architect just sat back and said, wow, you humanists are vicious. You're really good at critique, but I don't know where to go. I guess I have to leave. We're like, no, you're the architect. He said, what I want you to do is each go in a corner and take 5 minutes to draw what you think would be the ideal room. So we all went and drew a little room and came back. I now call this the architect's method. I think I may have even written a book about it. I don't know. But he looked at all of our little rooms. He said, look, let's take this from this, and this from this, and this from this. He said, I think we can make a room together. But that, to me, has been the lesson that stayed with me forever. That if you're great at critique and you suck at solutions, you shouldn't be making decisions for anybody. Get out of the way, right? And I do think that it's probably a problem we've passed on to some of our students, too, in the humanities, where the moment of critique has been so emphasized, that the moment of how the fuck you build something when you've just leveled every possible way of talking about it, that's a real issue. It's a real, did I say the F word? I never say the F.
Yeah.
But I would say, Priscilla, that's really been something that stuck. I was in my early 20s at the time. That's something that stuck with me ever since, and really an important lesson, and especially when you're dealing with dissertation students, right, who are both good at critique, and our job as dissertation directors is often to just tell them they write like a graduate student. Oh my God.
That was a lesson. One of the things I learned, and it's not directly related to that question, but it is related to what ethic you bring into administrative work. And I've always been one willing, I call myself civil rights generation. So you go around the rules, go upside or inside or whatever. And my husband, both my husband and my father my husband still living, of course, my father not, but he was deputy superintendent of schools for Buffalo. And they both told me, my father told me, know the money. The same daughter, he said, oh, you don't have to learn math. He started out teaching because you're a girl. How could, so it was that era. But then later, as an adult, he said, understand the budget. And my husband told me, never do anything that you will have to explain to someone else why you did it. Now, at that time, I was giving my wonderful assistant, Edwina Day, my parking pass to the Allen Building, because she ought to have a parking pass too and be able to get into there. But he said, think of yourself having to explain that to someone, which is, some violation of rules. So I got to the point where I never did anything that I would have to say, well, that had happened because then you're in the Fonnie Willis situation. I don't know, see, you all are working. I'm home watching CNN and Fonnie Willis on television, barging into the courtroom and say, wait, I'm gonna testify. So yesterday, I saw her anger, and I also saw she had put herself into a situation that she had to explain to someone. That will weaken whatever you are trying to do. Right. So find a rule-bound way to do it. You can do that, if you have to explain that this is a new rule and make it up. But if you put yourself in a position where you have to be, where somebody has to say, well, you did this incorrectly or against the rules or whatever, you've weakened what that objective is. So I tried, I took back the parking pass, had a difficult conversation, but I think she may have appreciated it later too, because we both learned, okay, how do we do this within the rules? Yeah. And learning how to work within the rules that Duke would make up as it went along. So I said, is this a rule? Is this a theory? Is this a practice? Is it a tradition and habit, in the law school? So I think I helped Duke clarify some of its own institutional practices. Write it down and show me what number this is in the faculty handbook, and we can talk. After that.
First, I, of course, can never say enough thanks for all that you've done, your leadership and everything. Karla, you just brought up this idea of an administrative ethic, and I wondered, I came into the Franklin Center as a staff member, and one of the things you broke down a lot of barriers between departments, but one of the things that I think you did, coming up with new rules perhaps, or was really flattening hierarchies between faculty, staff. I mean, the ways in which even, staff assistants and housekeeping were involved in the community life of the center, the intellectual life of the center and the Institute. I wonder if you could speak to, was that serendipity?
No.
That was just who we were.
That was not serendipity.
You go there.
Well, I mean, that was really a big principle that the community, Duke was, the plantation, right? And that we had to be honored, the honor that were people, everybody that worked there. And in fact, I wrote a blog this morning about one of the most amazing events. First of all, we had an event for everybody who'd worked in the building and on the building. And most of the workers, especially the sheetrockers, only spoke Spanish. They did not speak English at all. And Walter Mignolo and other very famous scholars who spoke Spanish served as translators. John Hope Franklin was there, you and I were there, Nan was there, and we went around and we shook every hand. And the head of one of the unions, the workers' union, said, he wanted, and their kids were there, so that everybody, John Hope was kissing every baby and hugging everybody. It was really amazing. And one of the workers said to Walter, who translated, that the head of the union said, these workers have worked at Duke for 20, 30 years, some of them. They have never before physically been in a building that they constructed after it opened. That was a principle. Yeah, it was absolutely not serendipity. It was really very much that if this isn't about community, why bother? So it was very much John Hope.
And it was understanding who made things happen.
Who made things
you might
happen.
have an idea, but Mark, you saved that it's not a podcast, that electronic technological moment. I think for me, it's, it's how I was raised to understand who the people are who do the work that make your life possible, are not the people whom people might expect. But I know I was thinking today of all of the people who worked in the Allen building. They knew they could come to my office after hours and because I had a table there, and have their lunch there. At night workers, they had permission to, and that's how I, broke a rule. I said, okay, you have my permission to use my office any way you want to. And at that time, you could still have couches in office too, so I could take a nap there. I think at some point, Duke had to get rid of the couches in office for other reasons. Mine was just a love seat. It wasn't big enough.
Oh, what's that?
But understanding that their care and attention for you. I remember used to shout, if they saw me across campus, housekeepers sometimes would shout at me, "Hey, Dr. Holloway!" Everybody on the campus. And somebody asked me, "Why are they yelling at you?" And I said, because they know I will, yell back and notice. Being unnoticed at Duke is not healthy. And not to mention not fair, not equitable, but not healthy for a thing that we keep calling a community. So the ways that we can build in to acknowledge is, I think, was always our personal ethic.
Definitely.
And so when we came to this project, it just became—
Make it real.
How do we make—
Institutional.
Yeah.
I taught a class at Duke, and so I got to teach as a faculty member at the FHI. I don't think I ever went back to English. So I taught
you left the department.
Pardon me?
You left the department.
I did leave the department, and not the happiest terms. But I taught a class where students each studied a building on campus instead of a field, and they would do ethnographies of the building 24 hours a day. Who goes into the building? Who can't go into the building? Who works in the building? Who's in the hallways? And I remember students coming back shocked to find out. One of my students said, "Do you know in Allen building there are these closets, and they look like they're supply closets because there's buckets and pails and mops and chemicals in them, and there's also a stool in them, and that's where the staff, the housekeepers, the maintenance people go to take their breaks all day long." They were utterly shocked that they were walking down corridors past these rooms where there were actual humans in there for half an hour taking their break. And that was a great class to teach. It was a real, and except that when they were in Karla's office, going into Karla's office. But those unseen things, I think, were very much motivational when we.
And how hard is that to make that an institutional culture rather than an ad hoc matter?
Yeah.
So, what I hope happened if there's a model from how we did things, although the way you describe it, it sounds so intentional, and I know it was like problem solving every day. And if there had been somebody to write it down, we probably remember a lot more. But part of it is involving folks whose ethic is to respect and care for their environment. And I just don't mean the physical environment, but the community of environment and how that happens. And if you find out that somebody has a need or a want or wants to go to school or take a class, you're an administrator. You ought to be able to figure out a way to help somebody out.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. It has me thinking about the humanity of this humanities space. And I actually happened to be passing through town. I got my PhD from Duke, I want to say 9 years ago. And coming back for this event had me thinking of my memories of the FHI, who employed me throughout being a grad student, but more than anything else, offered that safe haven as a student. And I am indelibly thankful for this space. So it's really amazing to sort of think about the history of how this came to being. I was able to go to South Africa for one of the JWTC workshops.
Wow.
I finished my dissertation here. I was able to work with the inaugural Haiti lab and work with Laurent Dubois and an undergraduate student on doing this installation. And we
should have a name. A
yeah,
plaque.
we should get a.
Yes.
And
It's still in progress.
Oh,
And
okay.
Deborah is
Yeah,
at the back there.
this
too.
is why you don't want me back.
And so if I could brag too, at our home institution, we ended up inviting Edouard Duval-Carrier, the artist who worked with different community members to create our own version at Grinnell called Visualizing Abolition and Freedom. It's green, it's also 35 blocks, but it's vertical. I was wondering sort of how you envision this space for students, because for me it was so foundational. And I think for so many students that have come through this space, we might not know the peculiarities of this history. By the time I was a second or third year grad student, that was when this warehouse opened and all these wonderful opportunities were just availed. So thank you.
Thank you, but we didn't envision it. We just knew that if there were students and faculty and staff working together, it would be their ideas. I think it was critical to both of us. I was kind of surprised when you said, Cathy and I co-founding. I said, somebody knows that? Because that was never our intent, to have something that depended on our personalities being here and driving it. As a matter of fact, I think we stepped back from many occasions, but it would be the people who came together. You come up with the ideas. Here, have a space and do something with it. I think that was, for both of us, the idea that we did come up with. I think when we started, we had a board, Franklin Institute, a board of faculty members, because we knew we had made the space. Now faculty think about how you are going to use it. So the various configurations of the Institute itself that has done different kinds of projects comes from you folks, not from administrators who can help you make it happen. And I think that has been important.
Were we co-directors first?
We were co-directors first,
so that
because
was,
nobody knew what it was.
Right.
And they weren't going to say, yeah, I'll be co-director of what? And we could, obviously we couldn't explain it to anybody with any, I mean, I just remember that board members are moneyed people who run corporations and organizations and are used to things in a certain format. Cathy has had real life organizational experience with Fermilab kind of thing. Me, I'm a humanities scholar, I think, so I'll put down every idea. But these folks wanted direction and clarity. And what is this reporting line going to be? And what, I was willing to trust the faculty to make it happen. But then the accommodation I had to make was to realize that my idea about you build it, they will come, was not going to translate to the people who were going to give money to make it happen. And that's where my weakness was in this, which is why I am grateful to Duke Development for not just tossing me out of my ear, although, Beth, I suspect there were times when you might have wanted to do that.
yeah,
And you worked closely with the Duke Board of Trustees. I was just Trinity Board.
right.
So
I wasn't, I had a big event yesterday in New York, so I wasn't planning on coming except on Zoom. And
I
it
knew
was
you would
Ken
come.
who said, how
she
often
would come.
does an institution you're not at recognize work you did? I mean, because I'm not even sure I thought of us. In fact, I looked at my bio today, and I don't say co-founder or anything on the bio. I put that in yesterday. I went back in. I could better add that. Because I think we did just do it because it was a great thing to do. And it was Ranji, that you're honoring us in this way.
It's
Institutions
so
don't
lovely.
love you, right? Don't
Yeah.
expect
And don't-
institutions
yeah,
to
that's-
love you.
Don't expect that.
Don't expect it. And this
But
happens.
have some other expectations of, well, if you're not going to love me, you can pay me right.
Unless you teach at a university where the tuition's $600 and $3,300 a year, and then nobody gets paid anything. I mean, my life is very different at the nation's largest urban institution right now. It's an amazing experience, but it's not the Duke experience. So talking about money is quite interesting from the perspective of the life I have now. But both are incredibly valuable. But to be honored like this and recognized for institutional work, that just doesn't happen.
It's interesting.
I kept hearing John Hope Franklin in my brain saying, it's not your wake. You know, people say these comments at your wake. They don't say it when you're still alive. You go there. You better get there. So, Ranji, thank you so much. And I don't think, have we seen each other since 2014?
There's a church in Durham that is honoring two people from the Duke community for Black History Month, and I'm one of them. And I said, but I don't teach there anymore. I'm emerita. And they said, but you co-founded the John. So I put that in my bio too. So this Sunday I get to have my grandson see grandmommy be a part of Black History Month. Wow. You know, so it becomes important differently when you reach the stage we are where we can reflect. Of course, you're still in the midst of it, but having been separated from Duke since 2007, because this is literally the first time I've been back. I did sneak into an audience where my daughter was doing something about when that movie came out about first Hidden Figures. Yeah. So I was back there in the dark, but I knew I had to make a definitive break from Duke. So I haven't done lunches and dinners and whatever because I needed to remember, you know, or refine, reconfigure who I was. So I needed the break. But when you sent the invitation, this was you know, did I answer you in a minute? Yeah, of course I will be there. And then Cathy saying she wouldn't come, I said, just watch. She can be there.
You know me, you know me. And then all of you came. It's moving beyond words.
It is.
It's really lovely to see everybody here. And,
There's a question.
We are at time, but Deborah is a former director of FHI, so I feel like I must make a moment to allow her to ask a question.
This whole event, and it's so difficult to define a mandate of the humanities, but you've really drawn attention to the singular way in which interdisciplinarity at Duke emerged from African-American history and from civil rights. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, when we think about those legacies, what you think that the current Duke administration can do to take this history of Black interdisciplinarity to keep freeing knowledge from oppressive legacies of power and to make the university into the community that it can be?
I think that it ought to ask the current faculty and staff how to do that. I actually don't know many of the contemporary administrators at Duke, and I don't know what's happening in terms of that. But any institution that wants to preserve and honor and note that legacy has to ask the people involved. This occurred, the example I have is when Duke did the Duke in Kunshan project. The people, it did not ask were the scholars who worked in China. You know, Ralph, I mean, we all know the names, but it was stunning to me that the people who did scholarly work at the institution, now if it were medicine, we would go to the physicians and the researchers who are making the breakthrough drugs and things like that. But we don't do that on this side of camp, or we did not back in my day, do that with as much ease. So if we don't tap into our own expertise, we as an institution, then we're not going to be learning from the folk who know the most. So I would say consult the faculty. Mm-hmm. Who used to have that? There used to be a sign somewhere, consult the faculty.
Yes, one of the people on my floor used to have a little sign on his thing saying consult the faculty.
What is the group of faculty who run the academic council? It was in that office. ECAC, it was in ECAC's office, consult the faculty. So we ought to always consult the faculty. And I don't know if we have that as an institutional ethic as easily in the humanities and social sciences as we do in some other sites of the institution.
And I would just add and broaden it beyond Duke. I mean, clearly we're at an era of new McCarthyism and the attack on real free speech, not fake weaponized free speech used to fire people and silence people is horrifying. And what's most horrifying to me is that we as faculty nationally, through our organizations and institutions, are not fighting back more collectively and powerfully. It's pretty shocking. The co-director of the Futures Initiative, which I run at the Graduate Center at CUNY, Shelley Eversley, is finishing a book on Black artists and writers. She's head of Black and Latinx Studies at Baruch College and also at the Futures Initiative. She's co-director. She's finishing a book on Black writers and activists under McCarthyism. And I've read this many times in many variations, and we talk about this all the time. It's worse now, not less, worse now, on an institutional level than what happened under McCarthyism. And that we're not fighting back, that our presidents, university presidents, what about there's a whole organization of university presidents, where's their statement on this? What happened at Harvard and Penn? I mean, it's unconscionable to me that we're so feckless and cowardly at this moment. And it's going to get, depending on what happens in a year from now, it could be all-out fascism, in my opinion. But even without that, the fascistic repressions that are happening all over since the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, which was a very limited decision that our universities are enforcing far more than the actual laws of that we've got one group of people suing every university, but not other people suing back about defamation of character and other kinds of things, is appalling to me, just shocking and appalling to me. And this should be a national cry on every campus all the time right now, because what we're about to lose is huge. And what we're not about to lose, what we are losing. 650 books banned in Florida. Sociology, no longer counting as a graduation requirement for a general education requirement for college students in Florida. What? I mean, that's institutionally, that's astonishing. And humanists should be way out there because we know the history. And we should be leading this charge.
Feeling our own precarity
Totally.
in this. And
Totally.
so leading an initiative today means something in the social media age, I think means something totally different than, I keep thinking if lacrosse had happened and there had been Twitter.
I still get my death and hate threats at least once a month from 2006, no question.
But I have to empathize with what it means to step out today and who else you are. I mean, it's not just...
it has to be collective.
Yeah, I mean, but who else within your own immediate family you might be? One of the things that impressed me yesterday as I was listening to the Georgia case on television is that one of the lawyers asked Fonnie Willis, and where do your children go to college?
Wow.
And she said, bless her, you think I'm gonna tell you? She said in court.
But I bet it was on the internet within a second.
Yeah. And so that kind of precarity is real and dangerous and different today. So I think it's a fraught landscape and it's not easy to step out.
Yeah. Although I have had students say to me, 18-year-olds say to me, back in the 60s, nobody was hurt when they protested. I'm like, what?
No.
What? And that history is not known, that people were killed by police and by their own institutions complying with police. And at Jackson State and Kent State, and well beyond. Yeah.
Claflin.
Well, friends, our work is set out for us.
Yes, we have an agenda.
You are doing the work, Ranji. See what brilliant hire? I mean, obviously I was
Well
right.
done, Dean. Thank you, Ranji. Thank you, Ranji. Thank you, everyone.
For coming. Thank you both so much. This was really incredible. Thank you.